What if the story of humanity didn't begin where you were told it did? What if the first sacred words weren't written in the deserts you imagine, but spoken under African skies, long before scripture had a name? And what if that truth was never lost, only redirected? Tonight's story isn't about replacing beliefs, it's about uncovering what came before them, a lineage of wisdom older than Genesis. A spiritual memory guarded, fractured, renamed, and carried across continents without ever fully disappearing. This is the story of African scriptures older than the Bible, you know. Not myths, not fantasies, but foundations, buried under translation, power, and selective memory. As you listen, don't rush to agree or disagree. Just notice what resonates. Notice what feels familiar in a way you can't quite explain. Because some truths don't announce themselves, they recognize you. If this kind of ancestral revelation speaks to you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These stories have traveled far, and they're still traveling. Long before ink met parchment, before temples cast long shadows over deserts, Africa breathed stories into the air itself. Knowledge didn't sit on shelves. It walked, sang, and was carried by memory. The elders said truth didn't need paper to survive, only people willing to listen. Funny how that idea makes some historians uncomfortable. There was always a question they avoided, one whispered but never printed. What if the first sacred stories didn't start where we were told they did? What if the origin point was moved, not discovered? Funny thing about origins, they're easy to relocate once power decides where history should begin. In the heat of ancient lands, where stone still remembers footsteps, spiritual law wasn't imposed, it was observed. Creation wasn't chaos tamed by force, but order recognized through sound, rhythm, and breath. The word didn't descend from the sky. It rose from the earth, already alive. Travelers carried fragments of this knowing as they moved north and east. Symbols shifted shape, names changed tone, meanings were repackaged. And somehow, the copies survived, while the source faded into silence. Or so the official story goes. Yet silence doesn't mean absence. It just means waiting. And as the wind moves across sand and ruins, it starts to sound less like coincidence and more like preparation for the next layer to surface. Africa was never empty land waiting to be named. Long before foreign maps drew borders, the continent held cities aligned to stars, calendars carved into stone, and laws shaped by balance rather than fear. This wasn't mythic exaggeration, it's archaeology that rarely makes it into textbooks. Strange, isn't it, how civilization always seems to start somewhere else? In river valleys and highlands, learning wasn't separate from spirit. Astronomy guided agriculture, ethics shaped governance, and memory replaced monuments. Power didn't flow from crowns, but from understanding cycles of nature, of people, of time. That kind of structure doesn't fit well with the old narrative of primitive beginnings. Somewhere along the way, Africa was reduced to a cradle and then quickly abandoned in the story. A starting point, never a center. Convenient framing. It allowed later empires to arrive not as borrowers, but as inventors. Funny how inheritance disappears when acknowledgement becomes inconvenient. Yet the evidence refuses to stay buried. Megaliths older than Stonehenge, mathematical systems predating Greece, spiritual cosmologies fully formed while others were still experimenting with gods. None of it accidental, none of it isolated. And once you see Africa not as a footnote, but as a foundation, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this knowledge existed so early, who was responsible for guarding it? And why did they choose secrecy over expansion? Before temples carried names, before gods were carved into familiar forms, the sacred had no face, only presence. In the highlands and valleys of Africa, origin stories weren't fantasies. They were encoded memories of how reality came into order. Creation wasn't sudden, It unfolded layer by layer like breath-learning rhythm. The elders spoke of forces older than personality, energies that shaped matter through vibration and intent. Later cultures would call them gods. Earlier ones understood them as principles. Funny how abstraction tends to scare people more than idols. These myths weren't told for comfort. They were instructions. How to live without breaking the balance. How to speak without disturbing the unseen. Every symbol carried weight. Every silence meant something. Nothing was decorative. Over time, these ideas traveled. Names shifted, attributes changed. A force became a deity, a principle became a commandment, and slowly, what was once fluid hardened into doctrine, not evolution, simplification. But the core never vanished. It hid beneath stories that sounded familiar but felt incomplete, and that lingering unease that sensed something came before wasn't imagination. It was memory, waiting to be remembered. Sound was the first doorway. Before symbols were drawn, before words were fixed, rituals were sung. Drums echoed heartbeats, chants bent attention, and movement aligned bodies with unseen currents. This wasn't performance. It was calibration. Funny how modern ears hear music where ancestors heard technology. Sacred symbols emerged from these rituals, not as decoration, but as compression. A spiral wasn't art, it was time folded inward. A circle wasn't beauty, it was continuity sealed. To the untrained eye, they looked simple. To the initiated, they were maps. Rituals demanded discipline. Fasting sharpened perception. Isolation stripped ego. Fire and smoke carried intention upward while grounding it below. Nothing happened quickly. Power, they believed, rushed only toward those unprepared to hold it. Later religions borrowed the gestures but skipped the preparation. The motions remained, the depth thinned. Knees still bent, voices still rose, but the inner alignment was gone. Ironically, the ritual survived better than its meaning. Still, traces remain, in rhythm, in pattern, in symbols that keep reappearing across continents. And once those echoes are heard, it becomes harder to ignore where the sound first began. At some point, memory became dangerous. Knowledge that once moved freely began to attract attention it never sought. When empires expanded, subtle wisdom posed a threat because it didn't need permission. It couldn't be taxed, crowned, or conquered. Funny how silence suddenly gets labeled as superstition when power feels insecure. Guardians of the old ways retreated, not out of fear, but strategy. Oral transmission replaced stone. Lineage replaced libraries. What couldn't be erased couldn't be written down. Outsiders mistook this for loss. It was camouflage. As invasions came, military, religious, ideological, stories were reframed. Symbols were renamed demons. Rituals were recast as heresy. What once aligned humans with the cosmos was reduced to folklore. A clean way to justify erasure without admitting theft. Colonization didn't just claim land, it claimed narrative. By rewriting origins, it disconnected people from memory. A person without memory is easier to guide or control. Depends who's holding the pen. Yet suppression leaves cracks, songs survive, symbols resurface, practices adapt, and every time something ancient refuses to disappear, it hints that the story isn't over, only paused. When fragments resurface, they rarely do so quietly. Stones unearthed where no one expected cities, manuscripts found in caves, monasteries, desert vaults, written in languages the mainstream once dismissed as peripheral. Funny how irrelevant texts keep showing up exactly where they're not supposed to. Some discoveries don't shout, they whisper, a symbol matching one across the ocean, a creation story mirroring another continent's scripture. Just older, less polished, more raw. Scholars call it coincidence when the pattern gets uncomfortable. There are texts that speak of creation through vibration, of moral law existing before kings, of divine authority rooted in balance rather than obedience. These aren't myths stitched together later. Linguistics, carbon dating, and comparative theology quietly confirm the timeline, if one bothers to look. Connections stretch outward, Africa to the Levant, to Mesopotamia, to the Americas, not through conquest, but through migration, trade, and shared cosmology. The map of ancient knowledge looks less like a tree and more like a web, and standing at the center of that web isn't an empire, but a memory, one that keeps resurfacing, insisting that the story we inherited is missing its opening chapter. What followed wasn't collapse, but inheritance, quiet and unannounced. As power shifted northward, stories didn't disappear. They changed clothing. Names softened, edges smoothed, origins blurred. A wisdom once tied to land and lineage was reframed to fit temples and thrones. Funny how adaptation gets praised while attribution goes missing. Figures emerged in newer texts, bearing familiar traits. Lawgivers who spoke with authority, prophets who heard voices in fire, creators who shaped reality through speech. The similarities weren't accidental. They were edited continuations, trimmed to suit new audiences. In these retellings, Africa became background scenery, never the stage. The source turned invisible while the message traveled freely. It's easier to accept a story when you don't have to acknowledge who told it first. Yet subtle markers gave it away. Cadence, metaphor, moral structure. The rhythm felt older than the script. The ethics echoed a system that valued balance over dominance, harmony over fear. Too refined to be improvised. And so the question lingers beneath the surface of familiar verses. If the wisdom sounds ancient, but the setting feels relocated, how far back does the trail really go? Time didn't erase the old knowledge. It buried it under noise. In the modern world, speed replaced depth, and fragments of ancient truth were labeled esoteric to keep them safely ignored. Funny how what once guided civilizations now gets filed under curiosity, not foundation. Yet the echoes persist. In spiritual movements searching for roots, in communities reclaiming symbols once stripped of meaning, in scholars quietly admitting that Africa's role was never marginal, just inconvenient to highlight. The past keeps knocking, even when the door stays closed. For the descendants of those silenced traditions, the impact runs deeper than history. It touches identity, faith, self-perception. When origins are erased, people inherit questions they were never meant to carry alone. Across the diaspora, a subtle shift is happening. Not rebellion, recognition. A remembering that doesn't ask permission from institutions. It simply reconnects what was separated. And as that reconnection strengthens, another realization begins to surface. If so much was hidden this long, what else is still waiting beneath the surface, untouched by light? The silence around these truths was never complete. It lingered like a low hum beneath modern narratives, subtle but persistent. Museums displayed artifacts without context. Universities taught fragments without lineage. Funny how absence can be curated just as carefully as presence. Those who went looking, really looking, noticed patterns. African cosmologies embedded in philosophies taught elsewhere. Moral frameworks that mirrored older systems of balance, not dominance. The deeper the research went, the less borrowed it all seemed. Some guardians never vanished. They adapted. Knowledge moved through bloodlines, through ritual, through coded language. Not everything needs ink to endure. Some things survive better without it. What's emerging now isn't revisionism. It's restoration. A slow, deliberate stitching back of what was cut apart, not to replace one story with another, but to widen the lens. And as that lens widens, it points toward an unsettling possibility. The foundations of global belief systems may rest on ground far older and far more African than we were ever taught to expect. History likes clean endings. Africa never offered one. Its legacy didn't conclude, it dispersed. When people were moved, enslaved, displaced, or scattered, memory traveled with them, hidden in cadence, gesture, and intuition. Funny how culture survives even when language is stripped away. Across oceans, fragments reassembled in unfamiliar soil. Rhythms resurfaced in songs. Symbols reappeared in art. Spiritual instincts endured in ways no doctrine could fully suppress. What was meant to be erased, adapted instead. This continuity wasn't always conscious. Many carried it without names or explanations, only a feeling that something ancient was watching, guiding, reminding. Memory doesn't always speak. Sometimes it pulls. Modern systems tried to replace that pull with structure, religion without roots, history without context. But something essential was missing. The soul recognized the gap even when the mind didn't. And now, as those fragments begin to align again, a deeper realization starts to form. The story isn't about what was lost, but about what refused to die. And what happens when it finally speaks in full. Long before anyone argued over doctrine, there was an agreement older than belief itself. Balance mattered. In ancient African thought, morality wasn't enforced by fear of punishment, but guided by harmony with the visible and invisible worlds. Actions echoed. Nothing happened in isolation. Funny how that idea feels radical today. Law emerged from observation, not decree. Seasons taught patience, stars taught timing, community taught responsibility. The sacred wasn't locked in temples, it moved through daily life. To break balance wasn't sin, it was disruption, and disruption always returned. When later systems absorbed these principles, they tightened them. Fluid ethics became rigid rules. Balance turned into obedience. The shift made control easier, but wisdom thinner. Order survived, context didn't. Still, traces remain in moral codes across cultures, emphasis on justice, restraint, accountability. They feel ancient because they are, older than the institutions that now claim ownership over them. And once morality is seen as inherited rather than invented, another question presses forward quietly. Who decided which versions were preserved and which were allowed to fade? What unsettled later empires wasn't Africa's spirituality, it was its independence. Knowledge there didn't flow upward to a single throne or priesthood. It circulated. Anyone disciplined enough could access it. Funny how decentralization becomes dangerous the moment authority wants permanence. Power prefers ownership. Ancient African wisdom resisted that instinct. It couldn't be monopolized, only embodied. That made it resilient and threatening. Systems built on hierarchy don't coexist comfortably with systems built on balance, so control took another form. Narratives narrowed. Complexity was labeled confusion. What couldn't be dominated was dismissed. Over time, simplification masqueraded as clarification and erasure as progress. Yet domination always leaves residue. Suppressed systems don't vanish. They go underground, they wait. And waiting in this context wasn't weakness, it was endurance. Because the longer something survives without permission, the clearer its strength becomes. And that strength hints at the next layer of the story, where resistance isn't loud, but inevitable. When resistance stays quiet long enough, it starts to look like patience. Ancient African knowledge didn't fight its erasure head-on, it outlived it. While empires rose and collapsed, these traditions learned how to breathe beneath the surface. Funny how survival is often mistaken for submission. Some truths were folded into stories, others into proverbs, some into gestures so ordinary they escaped suspicion. What looked harmless carried depth, what sounded simple held structure. Outsiders heard folklore, insiders heard instruction. Across generations, this wisdom moved sideways, not upward. Grandparents to children, masters to apprentices, night fires instead of monuments. Memory proved harder to destroy than stone. Even when written records vanished, pattern remained. Rhythm, symbol, ethical instinct. A way of seeing the world that refused to flatten reality into good versus evil. Balance stayed central, even when language failed. And as these patterns persist across time and distance, they quietly pose the next question. If so much endured without visibility, how much more has been preserved in places no one thought to look? At some point, the fragments began to recognize each other. A symbol seen in West Africa mirrored one etched into stone far across the ocean. A story told in the Horn echoed in the Americas, altered in tone but not in core. Funny how distance fails to erase what was never meant to be isolated. Scholars hesitated to connect the dots. The implications were inconvenient. Shared memory suggested shared origin, and shared origin challenged the idea of isolated genius. It's easier to believe civilizations invented themselves than to admit they inherited. Trade routes once stitched continents together, not just with goods, but with ideas. Gold traveled alongside cosmology, salt alongside law. Stories moved faster than armies ever could. Knowledge didn't conquer, it circulated. Over time, borders hardened and histories narrowed. What was once a network became a series of silos. Connections were reframed as coincidence, similarities dismissed as parallel evolution, a neat explanation for a messy truth. But patterns don't lie forever. And as more connections surface, they quietly prepare the ground for the next revelation, one that doesn't ask whether Africa influenced the world, but how deeply that influence still runs. The deeper those connections ran, the harder they were to fully conceal. Even in rewritten scriptures and polished doctrines, seams remained visible. Concepts didn't quite match their new settings, like old stones reused in newer walls. Funny how borrowed foundations never sit perfectly straight. Creation through speech, law rooted in balance, humanity shaped as caretaker, not ruler. These ideas appeared again and again, wearing different names, carrying different accents, but breathing the same logic. Too consistent to be accidental, too old to be recent. What later traditions called revelation, Africa had long treated as remembrance. Not something granted from above, but something recalled from within. That distinction matters more than it seems. It changes who holds authority and who doesn't. Over time, repetition dulled curiosity. Familiar stories stopped being questioned. Their ancestry faded behind ritual and routine. Yet something always felt unresolved, like a sentence missing its beginning. And that missing beginning keeps pressing forward, quietly demanding attention, because once origins resurface, belief itself has to renegotiate where it stands. As belief renegotiated its footing, institutions tightened their grip. Certainty became currency. Questions turned suspicious. Funny how doubt is welcomed in science, but treated like treason in matters of faith. The more ancient the root, the more carefully it had to be trimmed. Canonization wasn't just about inclusion, it was about exclusion. Councils decided what counted as sacred and what didn't, often centuries after the fact. Texts that didn't align with the approved narrative quietly vanished, especially those pointing south, back toward Africa. What survived was streamlined. Messy cosmologies were simplified. Fluid ideas were fixed into law. The mystery that once invited contemplation was reduced to answers that discouraged it. Stability achieved, at a cost. Yet even filtered truths carry residue. They retain echoes of what they once were. The discomfort many feel when reading certain passages isn't confusion, it's recognition, sensing depth where none is acknowledged. And that unease sets the stage for the next unraveling, where the question isn't whether something was removed, but why its absence still feels so loud. Absence has weight. When something essential is removed, it leaves a shape behind. In spiritual history, that shape feels like a hollow where certainty should sit. Funny how people call it a crisis of faith, when it's really a crisis of incomplete memory. Across centuries, believers sensed it, something older whispering beneath polished doctrine, a pull toward origins that weren't named. Pilgrimages went east, but intuition kept drifting south. Not rebellion, instinct. Some traditions tried to fill the gap with ritual density, others with authority. None fully succeeded. You can't replace roots with structure and expect the tree to feel whole. The imbalance always shows. This is why questions keep returning, why creation stories echo each other across cultures, why moral law feels universal, yet its sources remain disputed, why Africa appears everywhere except where credit is assigned. And that persistent absence keeps opening the door to the next mystery. If something so foundational was removed, who benefited most from keeping it that way? Power answers that question quietly. Those who control origins shape legitimacy. If authority appears divinely appointed from a single place, it becomes unquestionable. Funny how geography can sanctify power when memory is selective. By shifting the spiritual center away from Africa, newer systems claimed originality instead of inheritance. Borrowing became revelation, continuation became exception, and the source faded into abstraction, acknowledged vaguely, never specifically. This wasn't done with one decision, but many small ones. A footnote removed, a translation adjusted, a context omitted. Over time, the structure stood firm, even as its foundation went unnamed. Yet control built on partial truth is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement, fear of inquiry, suspicion of alternatives. The louder the defense, the weaker the ground beneath it. And that fragility hints at the next turn in the story, because once people begin tracing roots instead of repeating conclusions, authority has to answer to memory again. Memory has a way of resurfacing when pressure builds. In recent decades, voices once pushed to the margins began asking older questions with new tools. Linguistics, archaeology, genetics, all quietly pointing in the same direction. Funny how data starts sounding like prophecy when it confirms what was long dismissed. Ancient sites once ignored gained attention. Scripts previously labeled decorative were decoded. Timelines stretched backward, unsettling neat progressions taught for generations. Africa stopped looking like a beginning left behind and started looking like a center moved aside. This shift didn't come from institutions at first. It came from outsiders, independents, descendants reclaiming inheritance. Curiosity without permission proved more effective than authority with credentials. What emerged wasn't a single revelation, but a pattern. Repeated confirmations that Africa's spiritual and intellectual systems predated, influenced, and outlived many frameworks now considered foundational. The past grew larger, not clearer. And as evidence continues to accumulate, it quietly sets up the next tension, because acknowledgement demands responsibility, and responsibility changes how the present must be understood. Acknowledgement doesn't arrive without consequence. Once Africa's role is seen clearly, the present starts to feel different, less inherited, more borrowed. Funny how that realization makes some people defensive. History feels safer when it flatters. For many, this awakening isn't academic, it's personal. Identity shifts when origins shift. Faith feels less like obedience and more like dialogue. Spirituality stops being something received and starts becoming something remembered. Across communities, a quiet recalibration is happening. People revisit symbols, languages, rhythms, not as nostalgia, but as restoration. Not to replace beliefs, but to deepen them. Roots don't erase branches, they strengthen them. This reconnection doesn't ask for permission from institutions. It happens in conversations, art, study circles, late-night research, and moments of recognition that feel strangely familiar. As if something long buried finally exhaled. And that exhale carries a final tension forward. If reclaiming memory changes how we see ourselves, what does it demand we change about the world we're still building? What the world is building now still rests on old assumptions. Political borders, religious authority, even ideas of progress lean on stories about who came first and who followed. Funny how fragile modern certainty becomes when its timeline gets questioned. If Africa isn't just the beginning of humanity, but a long-standing steward of knowledge, then hierarchy looks different. Influence shifts, credit realigns, and systems built on selective memory start to feel unstable. That's why resistance to this narrative isn't loud denial, it's quiet discomfort, a refusal to look too closely, because once origins are corrected, accountability follows. Cultural, spiritual, even economic. Reclaiming memory doesn't demand revolution, it demands honesty. And honesty reshapes priorities in subtle but permanent ways. It changes what gets valued, funded, preserved, and as these realizations settle in, they prepare the ground for the final layer of this story, where the past isn't something to uncover, but something that asks to be carried forward consciously. The past doesn't ask to be worshipped. It asks to be respected. Ancient African knowledge was never meant to freeze in time. It was meant to move, adapt, and guide. Funny how modern culture treats ancestry like a museum piece instead of a living compass. What survived wasn't a rigid doctrine, but a way of seeing. Balance over domination, memory over monument, relationship over rule. These principles don't expire, they resurface wherever systems start cracking under their own weight. Today, echoes of that worldview appear in movements seeking reconnection, with land, with community, with spirit, not as imitation, but as resonance. People recognize the pattern before they know the source. This isn't about returning to the past, it's about carrying forward what was refined there. Africa's legacy doesn't demand a throne. It offers orientation, a reminder that wisdom doesn't need conquest to endure. And that reminder opens the door to the last lingering question. If this knowledge was never lost, only ignored, what responsibility comes with finally listening to it again? The revelation closes the way ancient ceremonies once did, without finality, without locks. In the old traditions, endings were never walls. They were thresholds. Knowledge wasn't handed down to be finished, but to be carried. Africa's spiritual legacy doesn't sit behind us. It walks beside us. In symbols we still recognize, in questions that refuse to fade, in a quiet knowing that something essential was never truly erased, only waiting for the right moment to be remembered. Beneath deserts, beneath archives, beneath the noise of modern certainty, many mysteries still sleep, not because they are weak, but because they require listeners prepared to hear without fear. The past is patient. It has outlived empires before. What has been revealed here is only one fragment of a much older current, a reminder that identity, faith, and memory are deeper than any single book or border. And that honoring the source doesn't diminish the present, it strengthens it. If you feel that pull to continue, to listen further, to remember more, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Other revelations are still rising, and the story is far from over.